The coldness came first, a serpent coiling in Nalin's gut, before her eyes confirmed the reason. Where 200 of the people's finest horses had grazed under the watch of the moon, there was now only trampled grama grass and the unnerving quiet of absence. She stood on the ridge, the pre-dawn air sharp in her lungs, her responsibility of physical weight on her shoulders. These were not just animals, they were life, wealth, and spirit. They were her charge, and they were gone. Her hands clenched on the smooth wood of her bow. There would be a reckoning. She was a hunter of tracks, and these thieves had left a story stamped into the dust, a story she would read until its final, bloody page. Miles south, Jedediah Stone tasted that same dust. For 3 days he'd been on the trail of 10 head of his own cattle, stolen from his small, hardscrabble ranch. The tracks were clumsy, made by men who cared more for speed than stealth. They led him not to a hidden pasture, but to the mouth of a narrow box canyon hewn into the Dragoon Mountains. The air smelled of horse. Too many horses. He left his weary buckskin tied in a cluster of mesquite and crept forward, his body low to the ground. The sight that met him stole the breath from his chest. It wasn't his 10 steers. It was a sea of horseflesh, paints, bays, and powerful Appaloosas, all bearing the subtle markings of the Chiricahua Apache. At the canyon's mouth, 2 men sat by a low fire, their rifles across their laps. Their saddles bore the Triple T brand of Marcus Thorne, a land baron whose ambition was as vast and empty as the desert itself. Jed sank back behind a screen of Ocotillo, his mind a turmoil. These weren't Thorne's horses. To steal from the Apache was to court a war. Thorne was too arrogant to fear, but too foolish to win. Jed's fight was with the men who stole his cattle, a private matter of survival. This was something else entirely. It was a violation, an act of profound disrespect that set his teeth on edge. He could ride away. It wasn't his trouble. But the image of the proud, restless animals, penned like common stock, stuck in his craw. Doing the right thing when no one was watching was a lonely creed, but it was the only one he owned. That night, under a sliver of moon that gave no comfort, he worked. A rock slide, carefully started far up the canyon wall, served as his diversion. As Thorne's men scrambled toward the noise, Jed slipped past them. He moved through the herd, a low whistle and a calm presence untangling their panic. He cut the rope corral and with a sharp cry drove them out into the darkness. It was a wild, desperate stampede, a 16-mile ride through treacherous arroyos and thickets of catclaw, with the shouts of Thorne's men fading behind him. He pushed them hard, guiding the river of horseflesh north, toward the foothills that marked the edge of Apache land. As the sky bled from charcoal to violet, he found a wide, grassy quinega he knew they favored. The horses, exhausted but safe, immediately lowered their heads to graze. Jed watched them for a long moment, the rising sun catching the sweat on his brow. His work was done. He had asked for no payment and wanted no thanks. He turned his buckskin west and rode away, a solitary figure against the dawn. From a high outcrop of rock, Nellen watched him go. She had followed the tracks not of thieves, but of a rescuer. She had seen the impossible herd moving through the night, driven by a single rider. Now she saw the man himself, a white man, lean in the saddle, who didn't so much as look back at the fortune he had just delivered. He simply rode on, as if returning a lost tool. The elders would invent stories of spirits. Her people would celebrate. But Nalen would not forget the silhouette of the man who did an honorable thing for an enemy people for no reason she could fathom. 3 weeks later, the mystery still chafed at her. Honor demanded an answer. Why would a white man risk his life for the Apache? It was a question that defied every lesson she had ever learned about his kind. While her people celebrated the miracle, Nalin made a decision. She would find him. She would look him in the eye and understand the debt that now lay between them. His trail was faint, but she was patient. She found his small adobe shack tucked into the base of a lonely butte, a place that spoke of a man who preferred the company of wind and rock. For a full day, she watched him from the rimrock. He moved with a quiet economy, mending a fence, clearing stones from a small patch of earth where he hoped to grow corn. He spoke to his horse more than he spoke to the air. He was a man rooted in his solitude, and she felt a strange reluctance to disturb it. But the question remained. She descended the slope as the afternoon sun cast long shadows, her moccasins making no sound on the dry soil. She stopped 20 yards from him. He was splitting wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He must have sensed her, for he stopped mid-swing, the axe head buried in a log. He didn't startle. He simply straightened up, turned, and waited. His eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, held no fear, only a calm watchfulness. "The horses you returned," Nalin said, her voice clear in the still air. She did not waste time with greetings. "Why?" Jedediah pulled the axe free and leaned it against the chopping block. He wiped a smear of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He considered her for a long moment, taking in her proud bearing, the intelligence in her dark eyes. He gave a slight shrug, a gesture that dismissed any notion of heroism. "They weren't his to take," he said. The words were plain, unadorned. It was not an apology or an explanation. It was a statement of fact, as simple and solid as the rock beneath their feet. Nalin studied his face, searching for the lie, the angle. She found none. Before she could ask another question, the sound of approaching riders broke the silence. 3 men, their faces hard and bearded, rode into the clearing. The Triple T brand was on their saddles. The leader, a thick-set man with a cruel twist to his mouth, spat on the ground. "Well, look what we have here, Stone. Found yourself a pet?" His eyes lingered on Nalin with a predatory ugliness. "Thorne wants his property back, starting with the price of 200 horses. Jed didn't look at Nalin. He stepped slightly to the side, placing himself between her and the men, but not in a way that shielded her. It was a subtle shift, positioning himself as the first obstacle, not her protector. He didn't tell her to run. He didn't treat her as a weakness to be hidden. His stance was an unspoken acknowledgement. This was their fight now. "The horses were never his," Jed said, his voice flat. "And she's not part of this." "She is now," the leader sneered, reaching for the pistol on his hip. The world exploded into motion. Jed didn't draw his own gun. He dove forward, grabbing the barrel of the leader's rifle and using it as a lever to haul the man from his saddle. The other 2 spurred their horses, one charging Jed, the other wheeling toward Nalin, seeing her as the easier target. He was wrong. As the rider leaned down to grab her, Nalin moved like a flicker of shadow. A knife appeared in her hand. She sidestepped the horse's charge, her blade slicing upward across the rider's thigh. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and fought to control his panicking mount. Jed, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of desperate, efficient violence. He slammed the butt of the stolen rifle into the face of the man on the ground, then turned to face the 3rd rider. He was outmatched, a man on foot against a mounted opponent, but he stood his ground, his face a mask of grim determination. He was buying time. Nalin saw it. She saw the cowboy's raw courage and the impossible odds. She notched an arrow to her bowstring, a smooth, practiced motion. The charging horseman was focused entirely on Jed, his pistol raised. Nolan's arrow hissed through the air and buried itself deep in the man's shoulder. He cried out, dropping his gun as his arm went numb. The fight was over as quickly as it began. The man with the sliced leg and the one with the arrow in his shoulder fled, dragging their stunned leader with them. They disappeared over the rise, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the heavy silence of the aftermath. Jed stood breathing heavily, a long, bloody gash on his forearm where a bullet had grazed him. He looked at Nalan, then at the arrow still quivering in the dirt, where the third rider had dropped it. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. Nalan walked over to him. She tore a strip of cloth from her own sleeve, her movements precise. Without a word, she began to clean and bind his wound. He stood perfectly still, allowing the intimacy of the touch. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the truth of the fight. He had not fought to save a damsel. He had fought beside a warrior. When she finished, she tied the knot and met his gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was steady. "You fight like a man who expects to live," she said. It was the highest compliment she could offer. He had passed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and rose. The threat had passed, but its shadow lingered. Thorn was not a man to forgive a debt, real or imagined. He would be back, and with more men. "This place is no longer safe for you," Nalan stated, looking at the small, vulnerable shack. Jed nodded, gingerly testing the bandage on his arm. "Reckon not." He looked around at the meager homestead he'd poured his sweat into. It was all he had, but he knew she was right. Nalan made her second momentous decision of the day. She had come seeking answers and found a man of honor. That honor now demanded a response. "My people have canyons in the Chiricahuas," she said, her voice low and serious. "Places Thorn's men will never find. You would be safe there." The offer hung in the air between them, immense and unprecedented. To shelter a white man among her people was a risk that could cost her everything: her standing, her authority, even her life. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a bridge thrown across a chasm of hatred and mistrust. Jedediah looked at her, truly seeing the weight of what she was offering. He saw the strength in her, the fierce pride that made such an offer an act of profound sacrifice.